So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar. And welcome back to so many of you who I can see have joined, who have been on our webinars previously. So, this is the fourth in our series of the Your Future webinar program. And today is a very important subject. It's all about well-being. So, my name is Matt Robinson. I'm the Corporate Learning Manager for Robert Half. To let everybody know, I've been with Robert Half for 5 years. However, I have got over 15 years experience within the recruitment industry, mostly within the learning and development sector. I'm also really pleased to be joined today by our panel of experts. We have Dr. Philippa Spencer, Heather Darwall-Smith, Claire Blissitt, and Lucile Allen-Paisant. Just bear with me. By way of introduction, Philippa, I don't know if you'd like to give a quick introduction of yourself.
Of course. So I'm Philippa Spencer. I'm a chartered psychologist. I spent years in the NHS working with people affected by a range of mental health conditions. I now run my own practice, and I split my time between a clinical caseload and working with organisations and individuals in the context of well-being. So I do a mix of coaching and workshops and seminars. My areas of particular interest are stress, burnout and resilience. So I'm really pleased to be involved in the webinar today.
Thanks, Philippa. And Lucile?
Yes, I'm Lucile. I'm a wellbeing consultant, specifically interested in burnout prevention and how we can prevent burnout from happening from a workplace perspective, but also outside of the workplace, because burnout has some lifestyle elements and elements are outside of work as well. I have been doing it for a few years now, and also run a yearly festival called Leeds Wellbeing Week to bring all the knowledge that we build in the workplace to the public space for citizens here.
Thank you, Lucile. Claire?
Hi, my name's Claire Blissitt. I run an executive coaching business, and I primarily focus on senior leaders who are stuck and they think they want to make a change in some way. So I'm currently coaching a broad range of different types of people from different industries, be it from a senior director with a national newspaper all the way through to the CEO of a charity. My background is that I've spent the majority of my career in senior commercial, mostly commercial, and some operational roles. My last 3 roles were COO roles. I've always been really passionate about people, and I'm really curious around what drives change in people and also in businesses. And at the moment, I'm currently doing a master's in coaching and behavioural change. So it kind of really ties up a lot of the things that I've learnt throughout my career with my current business.
Thank you, Claire. And Heather?
Hello, I'm Heather Darwall-Smith. I'm a mindfulness-based sleep and trauma psychotherapist. I work in London at the London Sleep Centre and also privately and online in Oxford. I work with a mix of people, anyone from the age of 18 to however old you're going to get, because lots of people cannot sleep. I'm really interested in how the body stops us from sleeping. So stress is endemic in our society, and we tell ourselves a lot of stories about what's going on, but actually the physiology of what is happening to us is important to understand. To really get into the nitty-gritty of that, I'm studying sleep medicine and MSc in sleep medicine at Oxford, where my research topic is what comes first, good sleep or poor mental health, or is it the other way around?
Thank you, Heather. So, look, we're really grateful for your time today, sharing your views and experience with our attendees. And just to kick us off, as the country navigates its way out of lockdown and the economy recovers, Robert Half want to provide help and support, tips and tactics for anyone who may be concerned about their job prospects, those who are currently out of work through redundancy or job loss, or those that are actively looking for a change. So in our recent webinars, the polls have shown that increasingly people are either worried or concerned about the future. So we're really pleased that we are, doing something that we can to help those out there. So the last 3 webinars have provided excellent advice on clarifying goals, recognizing your opportunities, and networking and personal branding. If you're new to today, please do watch the recordings of the previous webinars, because I'm sure there's some really helpful tips in there as well. But in order for us to gauge the thoughts and feelings of our audience today and bespoke our conversation to reflect this, we will be running a number of polls throughout the next hour. When I run the poll, the question will pop up on the screen, and you just need to click the answer that's most relevant for you. Also, as we progress through the webinar, there may be questions that you want to ask the panel. Please submit those questions through the Q&A icon, which is either at the top or bottom of your screen. And we'll be answering them from around about 12:30, 12:35. As we go through the session, I will sort of review the questions that we've got, and I'll try and collate and theme them, and we'll try and answer as many of those questions as we can. But feel free to post them as we progress throughout this webinar. Also, be assured that your participation in all of the polls are totally anonymous. Also, that you can submit your questions and they can also be anonymous as well. I just want to point out at this point that the call is recorded. However, we can't see you or hear you on the screen. So like I said, everything is anonymous. So to start off, I'd like to run our first poll. So it's a poll that we've run throughout the series of webinars, all about how you're currently feeling about your job prospects at the moment. What's interesting is we've seen a shift as we've gone throughout the series of webinars. So I'm quite interested to see where we sit right now. So I'm just about to launch the poll. So if you could answer this. So how do you feel about your job prospects at the moment? You can see that you have confident, ambivalent, anxious, or concerned. So I'm just going to leave it for a few seconds just to give everybody a chance to vote in that poll. I can see lots of people have answered already. We'll just keep it open for a little bit longer, and then I'll share the results with you all. Okay, so I'm just going to end the poll now if you haven't already put your answer in. And then I'm going to share the results. So you should now be able to see those results. I'm hoping the panel, you can see those results too. So unsurprisingly, I think this is following a similar trend to our previous webinars, where we've got 44% of people are feeling currently concerned, with 25% anxious. So hopefully, with the content of what we're talking about today, about well-being, mental health, this will allay some of those fears and give you some sort of support, guidance on how you can cope with maybe some of the anxiety that you may have. Okay, so I'm just going to stop sharing those results at the moment, and then I think what we'll do is move on to the first question that we have. So to our panel. Question number 1 is, since lockdown, what have been the increased challenges that people are facing that you're hearing of, and what are the coping mechanisms that you would recommend helping with them? So Heather, I think I'm going to pass that one over to you in the first instance.
Gosh, it's such a complicated answer, really, because it's almost had its own rhythm to it. We locked down and suddenly everyone's world changed, literally within a couple of days. And I think at the beginning there was a certain degree of excitement. Some people were very active online, doing lots of social engagement. But as time has gone on, I think one of the biggest things I'm seeing is how people's structures are falling away. So the rhythm of getting up every day to get ready for work, go to work, has fallen away. And we get up, if we're working, we're on screen the whole time. And there's a real merging between work and home life. And that separation isn't there anymore. And as a result, I think, of that structure falling away, lots of things are blending. So suddenly your family life, you might have, we've all seen these great videos of people's children coming in. Suddenly everyone's much more aware of people's family circumstances. It's sort of flattened out our relationships with everyone. But there is definitely a sense of people not necessarily finishing work at 5:30. It's becoming very much a slide into, well, I'm at home, I may as well just work for a couple more hours. And then there's a question over, what day is it? everything is very much sliding together. And I think as things have progressed, I'm really seeing, clearly I'm a sleep therapist, lots of people's sleep is fragmenting in different ways, but I'm also seeing some particular themes around loneliness and concern, fear. It's incredible, we live in this online world, and yet people being on their own, shielding, not going out, I'm really noticing the impact of that lack of physical, intimate connection that people are not experiencing, and for some people we don't know how long for. So I think it's a complicated question. The key themes for me would definitely be loneliness, lack of structure and boundaries, but I'm interested in what my fellow panelists have to say on that.
Thanks, Heather. Lucile, I'll pass over to you on that one.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Heather. I think all of this could be summarized with the word uncertainty, and how we thought we were living in a fairly certain world, or at least in a reality that we could manage and we had a good understanding of. And all of a sudden, everything is uncertain. And I think for our attendees today and the candidates, it's even more challenging, because in addition to the current uncertainties, you have the uncertainty of looking for a job and not really knowing what is going to happen professionally in the next few months. So in this specific context, I know the second half of the question is about what we could recommend to support. And there's one little exercise that I call the circle of control that can be a decision-making tool to deal with stress. So whenever you identify a stressful situation or stress factor, the first question that you might ask yourself is, do I have control over it? And if the answer is no, then as difficult as it might sound, we need to try our best to let it go, or to consider it as an illegitimate source of stress right now. So for instance, we have no control over the pandemic, but we have control over our attitude and our response to it. We have no control about a lost internet connection or difficulties to go online, but we have control over the different actions that we can take or make in order to reach out to people or do the tasks that we have to do. So it's that little question that I find very helpful personally, and even more so in the current situation, to just decide the sources of stress that are legitimate, the ones that are worth our time, our energy, and our mental space, and specifically the ones that we can take action towards, instead of only stressing about them without having anything to do.
Thanks, Lucile. That's great. That's already given me something to take away already. What can I control? What do I have control of? That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to question number 2 now. So just bear with me one second. Okay, question number 2, it's come in. Stress, anxiety, and burnout seem commonplace. What are the early signs of these, and how do you recognize them and build effective coping strategies? Philippa, I think I'm going to pass this over to you, first of all.
Thank you, yes. Let me start by saying that stress and anxiety are totally normal experiences. They are inevitable, and we will all experience them. They're part of our survival mechanism, and if it wasn't for them, none of us would be here. So we need them. For clarity, stress is a response to a perceived threat, whilst anxiety is the reaction you have to feeling stressed. So they're separate things, but they overlap. So they're kind of close cousins, really. What are the early signs of them? So early signs of stress will be familiar, I guess, to us. These are the things like the kind of heart pounding, your shallow breathing, your dry mouth, sweating, tension, you can't sleep, your digestion is all over the place, and you can't think very clearly. So you perhaps will find that you have impaired cognitive function. And all of these symptoms of stress are in the main influenced by the fact that your cortisol levels are probably increased. If you were to be monitoring my cortisol levels at the moment, you'd probably find that they'd taken a little bit of a spike, quite normal. What about signs of anxiety? Slightly different. This is about that feeling of dread and worry and fear and uneasiness. And I'm very mindful that 25% of you have kind of identified that you have feelings of anxiety. Burnout, I want to be really clear about burnout. Burnout is a separate thing. If you experience chronic continuous stress, so elevated levels of cortisol for a period of time, you become at risk of burnout. So that's a kind of end point. And the cluster of signs and symptoms there are different. This is about disengagement, loss of motivation, feeling hopeless, feeling cynical, feeling resentful. When you sometimes hear that somebody has had a breakdown or it's mental exhaustion, often what is being talked about is burnout. It's quite a serious state, quite a complex state to come back from. The really good news is that if we develop good coping strategies to manage stress and anxiety, we can avoid burnout. So that's some really good news. So I want to touch very briefly on this issue about effective coping strategies. If I were to sit here and go through all of the individual coping strategies out there, we'd probably be here until this time next year. There are many, many coping strategies. So I want to just instead talk about the 5 key areas of well-being, and under each heading come numerous coping strategies. Now these come from the New Economics Foundation, so these are evidence-based, and they are behind all the current public health messaging that we hear in the UK. So the first one is be active. The amount of evidence for the benefits of exercise, you could sink a ship with. We know this stuff is good for you. So whether it's gentle exercise through to training for a marathon, the benefits for your physical and mental health are without question. So be active. Secondly is the issue of connecting. So feeling connected to and valued by other people offers you a protective factor in stress and anxiety. You will manage it better. The third one is don't stop learning. So challenge yourselves, learn new things, build new neural pathways, boost your confidence and self-esteem. And again, you will find you're more resilient and more able to manage inevitable stress and anxiety. Penultimately, we have this idea about noticing. So that's about awareness of yourselves, of your thoughts, of your surroundings, of nature. You know, this is the mindfulness stuff, living in the present. And mindfulness has gained traction in the last few years, and some of you might already be practicing some of that. And then finally, give. So what this is about is that the research shows us that people who give support, compassion and kindness to other people feel happier, healthier, more resilient, and there's even research to show that those people live longer. So those are your 5 key areas, and you can explore all of the individual strategies that kind of exist within all of those areas.
Thank you, Philippa. That's fantastic. Really great advice. Thank you for that. Heather, just going to pass on to you if you have anything to add.
I think the only thing, what Philippa's just outlined is fantastic. The only thing I think I would add to that is in where she talks about noticing and about pausing. So when we're stressed, one of the things we might do is press send on that email. Perhaps going to sleep for a night and then re-looking at the email the next morning is a good thing. That's the point at which you get up and go outside for 5 minutes. So when things really are starting to build and it feels like you're living in a pressure cooker, pausing is the key that you have in that moment. Get up, walk away, go outside, cuddle your cat, make a cup of tea, whatever it is, pause and do not click send.
Great advice, and I've used that before, Heather, so thank you for that. Thank you very much. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I think we're going to move on to our next poll. So just bear with me. The poll is all about how you would describe your well-being over the last few months. So I'm just about to bring that onto the screen and launch that poll. So if you'd like to select your answer. So how would you describe your well-being over the last few months? Is it improved? Has it stayed the same? Or would you say it's deteriorated? So we'll just give you a few seconds just to have your vote on that. Again, I can see lots of people voting at the moment. That's great. So I'll just wait for those to finish. We've still got quite a few coming in, so I'll just wait for that. Okay, so I'm now going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results of what we have. So you should be able to see that. I'll bring that onto my other screen as well so that our participants should be able to see that. So we can see, yeah, so, okay, it's quite a lot of people saying that it stayed the same, which is, you know, good to hear. That's 31%. Not so great to hear that 44% of people feel that it's deteriorated. Has anybody got any comments on that from the panel?
That it's a very stark percentage. It doesn't surprise me, but you know,
Yeah.
it's difficult to hear that.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll stop sharing those results and we shall move into the next question, which I think will sort of lead into things that we can do to help with that. So let's have a look. So question number 3, how important are exercise, nutrition and sleep to your well-being, and what could your personal well-being strategy look like? So I think that leads on from something you were saying before, Philippa, about exercise. But Lucile, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, absolutely. They are very important. No surprise in my answer here. And to build on what Philippa was saying earlier about the 5 ways of well-being, I just want to make it clear that there is a cliche around well-being, around the word well-being, that is supposed to be doing yoga, practicing mindfulness on a regular basis, having the perfect nutrition every day. It's not all about this. As Philippa was saying, you have key areas and then you need to find what works for you for your well-being strategy. And what works for you might not be what works for me. Going for a walk, cuddling your cat, as Heather was saying, having a nice cup of coffee or calling a friend can all be part of your well-being strategy. So one tip here to identify these things that can help you is to look out for things that make you smile, that make you relax, or that make you disconnect. Anything that makes you not look at your phone, not check your email, is always a good way to start. And of course, in the current circumstances, there might be habits or hobbies that you used to have that you don't have anymore because you're not able to go to the gym anymore or to go for a drink with your friends anymore. So here the tip is to explore the gray zones. So you might not be able to go to the gym, but what about boot camp session in the park? I live next to a park and there are many personal trainers just outside, moving their sessions from inside to outside. So exploring these gray zones to make sure that you fill up your cup first. That same as when you go on a plane, if you remember, I know it was a long time ago that we probably all of us were on a plane, but the security procedure is to put your own oxygen mask first before putting it on anyone else. And that's the same in life. You need to make sure that you put your own oxygen mask, that you put yourself on your to-do list, that you plan some me time, as well as some working time, some family time. Make sure that you prioritize yourself. And that would be a good start for a well-being strategy.
Thanks, Lucile. And over to you, Heather. Obviously, we mentioned sleep in here as well, so I think it would be a good time to bring you in on this.
Yeah, I think what Lucile said about things being perfect, I think it's important to know that there's no perfect sleep. It's not a one size fits all. I might need 7 hours sleep, you might need 8. It's really varied. And I think it's also important to know that it's actually really normal to wake up, especially at the moment, and not necessarily to worry about it. The odd sleepless night here and there isn't a problem. So it's important if that's starting to happen, to know that it's normal and not to start to think my sleep is disintegrating and start to worry about it. Because that's where we then start to go down the path towards insomnia. Right now, in the middle of a global pandemic, I would never expect everyone to be sleeping all the way through the night, every night. It's just not going to happen. So I think there's something about relaxing around your sleep. If you're feeling rested the next day and you've had a bumpy night, then that's normal. But then I'm sure we're going to look at other things to do with how you would start to address things if things are starting to disintegrate, because there's all sorts of different things you can do.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for that. Great tips as well. So I'm just going to move on to our next question. So I'm mindful of time, so I'm just going to go through to this one. What are the most common sleep issues you are seeing, and what are the reasons behind these, and what advice would you give to those suffering? Heather.
So there's two things I'm seeing: a rise in insomnia, so people having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep or waking up too early. And I'm also seeing a rise in people reporting an increase in vivid dreams. There's been quite a few stories in the press around people having fantastic dreams. So firstly, with the rise in insomnia, that, as I alluded to in the first question, is partly to do with the breaking down of boundaries and the lack of structure, as well as the situation we find ourselves in. So what's really important is to not lose that structure. Sleep, it should occupy about a third of our day, 24 hours. And if we really make that a priority, so that that's not what gets squeezed right now. So that's about the last hour before we go to bed, creating a good wind down, relaxing, turning our phones off, turning the lights down so there's lack of blue light, and then going to bed at the same time every day and getting up at the same time every day. And that's 7 days a week, because if we shift into lions at the weekends, then we can get a sort of social jet lag. So structure is really, really important here, because without it, the body doesn't quite know where it stands. The vivid dreams thing is, there's lots of theories going on about it. One of the ones I think is really interesting is that because we're not necessarily getting up to an alarm clock, because we're not commuting, we're waking up within a phase of sleep called REM sleep, which is where we have a dream state. So we're remembering what's going on, and the vivid nature of it seems to be coming from heightened anxiety and thinking about what's going on and change. So it's a really curious thing that's going on, and I'm really looking forward to, after things start to get back to normal, a couple of people are recording these vivid dreams and looking to publish what people are experiencing. But know that it's really normal to have these really quite vivid technicolor, sometimes scary, but that's okay, dreams during what's going on right now.
Thanks, Heather. Philippa, do you have anything to add?
Just very quickly, actually, I think it's interesting to note that on average, we're getting about 20% less sleep than we were in the 1960s. Lots of that is due to what Heather was talking about. So, you know, pressures of life and sleep disorders. There's also the question about, are we making choices that might be denying ourselves sleep? You know, we've all been in that situation of thinking just one more episode of Breaking Bad, or just another half an hour on Twitter. So it's about reviewing, am I making the best choices? The benefits are so profound from good sleep, and it's one of the few things in life that is totally free. So I think if there are different choices you can make, it's just good to reflect on that.
Great, thank you, Philippa. Okay, next question number 5. So, what advice would you give to those who have developed bad habits, and how would they begin to develop good routine and good habits? Philippa, I'm going to pass to you again, if that's okay first.
Sure. So my main piece of advice is be kind to yourself. You are not alone. Everyone has bad habits that they default to. Some are behavioural. Those are the things we do to make ourselves feel better in the short term. Drinking too much alcohol, eating too much junk food or sugar, time online, time on your Xbox. Other bad habits are kind of ingrained, and they're the stuff we tell ourselves. So our mental scripts and our mindset. So you might have a mental script that says to yourself, I'm useless, I'll never get another job. These two kind of sets of bad habits are interlinked and they feed off each other. We consider them bad habits, not through any judgment, but because they are simply unhelpful and they undermine our well-being. We don't feel good when we engage in these things. Moving from bad to good habits, so making a change, that's not easy. And that's well illustrated by the fact that usually by mid or the end of January, we've all given up on our New Year's resolutions because behaviour change is difficult. So my main tip for you sits in the idea of marginal gains, and we borrow that idea from elite sport. Those of you who are interested in rugby might know that in 2003 Clive Woodward adopted a marginal gains approach to secure the World Cup. And what this is about is really, really small but consistent changes over time, which add up to really significant change. And the effects can be extraordinary. So whether that's the World Cup or winning the Tour de France, because British cycling use it too. So in the context of people like us, how can we use it? Well, identify your goal. Work out what is the first tiny step I can make. Who can help keep you motivated? And then start and keep going, just 1% marginal gain a day. And research tells us that if we sustain a behaviour change for 6 weeks, it's much more likely to become a long-term change.
Brilliant, thanks Philippa, great advice. Claire, have you got anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I think also sometimes it's really helpful when you're kind of critiquing and reviewing your habits to understand just a little bit more behind the thinking that goes on and the stages that you go through. So there's a couple of people who are really renowned, which I'll come to later on, but there's 4 key stages which helps you understand a little bit more about how you can put some corrective action in place. So the first thing is that with any habit there's always a cue or some kind of trigger, which is something that's initiating the particular behaviour. The second thing is that then leads to a craving, which is the change in state that you're trying to achieve. And then there's the response, which is the actual habit, and then there's the reward, which satisfies the craving. So let me just talk through a couple of examples which might bring that to life a little bit. So if I don't know, you have a message notification on your phone. So that pings up and that is the cue for a particular behaviour. The craving is that you're just desperate to know who's it from, what are they talking about. So you want to know what the content is, and that's the craving. The response is that you grab the phone to read the message. And so the reward is that you're satisfying your craving by knowing what the message is, by grabbing your phone. So what happens is that the ding of the message is associated with grabbing your phone. So I think sometimes it's helpful for people to understand those 4 phases, because then you can think, well, actually, because sometimes a lot of people miss the craving and go straight from the cue, which is the ding of the phone, and then thinking about kind of grabbing the phone. So if you understand and critique almost in question, okay, so what is the craving that's driving this behaviour? So how could I satisfy that craving in a different way? What strategies could I put in place? Another example, which maybe is just pertinent to me, I don't know, but drinking, for example. So you finish work, that's the cue. and your craving is that I just want to have a drink so that I can feel relaxed. That's the change in state that you're trying to achieve after having a really stressful day. The response is you have the drink, and basically what's happening is that you're finishing work and associating that with having a drink. So I think also by understanding the cues, you can start as well to think, well, okay, is there anything that I could do to change those cues? So sometimes I find it sort of helpful to explain those 4 loops with people. I think the other thing as well, which Philippa touched on, is Philippa talked about kind of the tiny steps, and she talked also about kind of the New Year's resolution that doesn't work. It's great to have a really ambitious goal, but breaking it down into steps, as Philippa said, is really, really helpful, because otherwise what the brain does is focus on the discrepancy between where you are now and where you want to be, which can mean that if you're not able to achieve that very quickly, you get very demotivated. So I think for me, probably some handy tips are about making it really specific. So if we talk about the drinking example, so instead of I'm going to stop drinking in the week, you might want to say at this particular time and this particular location, I'm going to do this instead. And also noting down and tracking your habits. So setting out what you're wanting to achieve and then really tracking those. So the purpose of that is by writing something down. We all know in business, when we write down people's objectives and we put those on paper, they're more likely to be achieved than just having a conversation. By writing them down, and then that makes them something that is very visible and transparent for you. And also it allows you to see and track your success and kind of celebrate the fact that you've been able to make progress. And then just one more thing, I'm really sorry, I hope we're okay with time, but one more thing that I think is really helpful is what's termed habit stacking. So what you can do is take a good habit that you have, so I don't know, something really, something you might not even perceive as a habit, so going in the shower every day. So you go in the shower, and then every single day after you've done that, then you might want to do 25 sit-ups or 25 press-ups or something. Or it might be that when you go to a meeting, if we ever have face-to-face meetings again, that when you're driving there, before you get out of the car, you just pause and you take a few deep breaths. So there are some really helpful worksheets out there that make all of this, what you do with habits and how you can kind of change them, really clear and really actionable, which I think, Matt, you're going to be distributing some of that information afterwards.
Yeah, correct. And thank you, Claire. I mean, great advice there. And interestingly, one of the first things you mentioned about turning off notifications, I actually did that really early on in the pandemic, because I was finding that what I was doing, probably doing more time at work anyway. Yeah. Did I mean sat at home doing more? But the notifications were possibly stressing me out a little bit, because I felt like I had to respond. So I gave myself some time, and I haven't turned them back on either. I've left them, because if I want to check my email, I can. I know they're there. I don't have to respond in that urgent way. So really great advice, Claire, honestly. And I will vouch for that. That's worked for me. So thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to our final poll. And this is all about how much time you're spending on your well-being each week. So I've just launched the poll. If you could type in your answers. So how much time are you spending on your well-being each week? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Or is it none at all? So again, I'll just give a few seconds for people to answer this. Again, we've got a lot of people answering, so just leave it open for a little bit longer. Okay, so it looks like we're coming to the end of that. I'm just going to end the poll, and I will share the results. And you should be able to see these on screen right now. I think that's really interesting, actually. It's really good to see that there's not that many people who don't spend time on their well-being. That's really good to hear, I think. Yeah, and I don't know what the advice would be, but spending at least some time on your well-being, I think, is a good thing. So even though people have put a little, I'd say that that's pretty positive. I don't know whether the panel
Yeah.
agree.
And maybe you think you spend no time at all on your well-being, but think back about the broader definition of well-being that we've given throughout the discussion. I'm sure you sleep at some point during the week, so that's also a key element of well-being. I'm sure you eat as well, more or less healthy meals, but there's some elements of well-being that we take for granted, and some, as Claire was saying, some good habits that we don't even consider as good habits because they're just habits. But try to think about it a little bit and explore what you actually do that gets you to get up in the morning, and that gets you to relax or disconnect or smile, as I said earlier.
Brilliant. And also, we've had a comment from somebody today saying that even attending this course is actually time towards well-being, to try and understand it a little bit more. So again, it's great that people are spending that time. So thank you for that. I will stop sharing those results. Okay, just to move on to a couple of our final questions. So question number 6 is about what should companies be offering employees to support from a well-being and mental health perspective, and really what questions should candidates ask prospective employers to understand what is on offer. So Lucile, over to you.
Yeah, from a candidate perspective, I would think of 3 things that candidates can look out for. The first element is a culture. What can you see about the culture of the organization? Do they have an open door policy? Are they open about mental health? Do they do some mental health campaign for Mental Health Awareness Week, which is every year in May, for example? So look out about, try to have some hints and cues about the culture of the organization, and specifically the managerial culture. What's going on and how you think you would get along with your manager, the person you do the interview with. Then the second element is to try to understand the fit with team members. And I know it might be challenging when you do virtual interviews and you don't get a chance to maybe visit the workplace or, get these informal conversations over a cup of coffee. But maybe try to connect with other team members or potential team members on LinkedIn, having some insights about what's going on in the organization. And then finally, the third point is to look at the support that they have in place in terms of the current support, maybe through their employee assistance program, through access to counselors if needed. Grief support is also a big one for well-being, but also the more informal type of support. Do they have some clubs, running clubs, walking clubs, some things that you can join, that you could join to meet people, to make friends at work, and to the bottom line is for you to find people you could be open with about your mental health, about your well-being, and people who you could become friends with, so that you would you would feel well in the workplace and outside of the workplace. Even though it's a virtual workplace and it might sound challenging, these are the tips I would share for you to look into.
Thanks, Lucile. And Claire, do you have anything to follow?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the question is about what candidates should ask employers. So my suggestion might be to start first, given what we've just been saying around well-being is such a broad topic and there isn't a one size fits all. And so actually the starting point for me is kind of really understanding what well-being means to me. Before I start kind of thinking about from an employer perspective. So how does it fit? So with my values, for example. So what sort of connection is there? What am I going to need? How does well-being and job fulfillment, how do they connect to each other? So how would I know if I've got it right? Where have I got it wrong in the past? Where can I learn? Or where have I got it right in the past? So using those sorts of things to target those sorts of questions that you might ask of the employer. I think the other thing as well to be mindful of is that at the moment there's quite a lot of benefits and things that come under the well-being and kind of that are offered to candidates that are almost quite exciting and new and different. So it used to be things like, I don't know, free breakfast or something like that. But if you think about it, these sorts of smaller things are very, very easy for an employer to offer, and they get you in the door. But for how long? So does that really contribute to your well-being? So it's kind of creates the excitement, but actually well-being is much deeper and goes on for a much longer period of time. And I think the other thing as well is that your well-being and your requirements of it change from the moment that you start with that employer to the moment that you leave. So probably what's more important is looking at employers who offer more flexible benefits. So learning and development might be more important at the beginning and pension might be more important at the end. So to what extent are they able to offer you that flexibility? I think one final thing I would say about well-being, obviously with the situation at the moment, working from home is a key thing that a lot of employers are mindful of. Prospective employees are looking to the extent that people can work from home. But I would add a little bit of caution around that to really understand the impact of working from home and how that's going to work for you, starting with a new job. Because I think if you think about when you normally start a new job and you're in an office, there's a lot of incidental development that comes through observing people in the office, listening to them on the phone, talking about products and services, how they're dealing with clients, and that all contributes to your incidental development. So how are you going to achieve that when you're not in the office? And equally, there's other things, like there was an expression that I learned the other week from someone called, some of you may be aware of Jamil Qureshi, who's a motivational speaker, who talks a lot about something called offbeats. And offbeats are those little interactions that you have throughout the day, walking to the car park, at the coffee machine, at the water chiller, and also the banter that you have in the office. And all of these things contribute to your well-being, and your fulfillment in that job. So I just think, just the working from home thing, I think we need to think a little bit more deeply around what we actually mean by that, and what strategies we're going to have for the bits that it doesn't quite fulfill. So yeah, it's once again, it's sort of a personal thing, but it involves deeper thinking.
Thank you, Claire. Again, some great advice. So I'm mindful of time. So what I wanted to do now is actually move over to the Q&A section, because we've had a couple of questions that have come in. So I want to open this up to the panel, if that's okay. I'm going to go to one of the first questions here. Okay, so what tips do we have from the panel with regards to moving to a positive change mindset? If I give you a bit of context here, looking at a probable change of productivity levels or enforced change of job or career in the coming months. So what tips do you have to move yourself to a positive change mindset and becoming more accepting of that? I don't know if anybody wants to pick that up.
Well, I'm happy to have a go at that.
Yeah.
Very good question. We probably all ask ourselves that question at some point in our lives. I think the main thing to be very aware of is that we're actually free to change our thoughts. Our thoughts don't define us. Our thoughts aren't necessarily a reflection of the truth. They are just our perspective. So we are free at any time to change the way we see the world and think about things. It's easy to say that, it's quite difficult to do that. But some of my tips around that would be looking at how can we reframe, so what's the evidence for the way we think about the world, and are we missing some important evidence? Using perspective, so broadening your perspective and then kind of re-looking at it. But thinking particularly about this kind of positive mindset, I would suggest people look at the idea about growth mindsets. So you can Google that. It's an interesting kind of theory about just giving yourself permission to think more positively so that you're always growing and can develop. So that might be something interesting for you to go away and look at.
Thank you very much, Philippa. Thank you. Another question that has come in, and I think it's in relation to activity. Basically, somebody's saying here that their main social activity is, I think, Lindy Hop dancing, but that's probably not likely to resume anytime soon. So how important is physical touch, dancing, hugging, etc., to wellness? Which I think is a really good question.
Yeah, it is a very key element because it helps with our happiness hormones in the body, the physical touch element. And the tip I would share here with the person who asked the question is to explore the gray zones again. So it might not be possible to go to a Lindy Hop class with so many people in a closed area. But maybe it's possible to meet with a few friends from the Lindy Hop group and to create this so-called gem bubble with those people that you would meet as part of your close network of friends. And they would be the one you would practice Lindy Hop with. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be, I'm not going to dance ever again in the coming month or years, or I'm going to go full on and do a class with 50 people in an enclosed space. There's this gray zone where you could potentially meet outside with a few people that you trust, who have respected the lockdown and who you think are safe to dance with, in a way. So there's always a risk factor involved, and we will have to deal with that risk in the coming months, meeting people and going back to the things that we used to do before. But exploring these gray zones and potentially create these small germ bubbles can be helpful to resume physical touch in a safe way.
Thank you, Lucile. I'm not sure if anybody has anything else to add. I can move on. No, that's good. Okay, so one of our other questions that has come in is how do you create a support network, and what is out there for those with difficulties? Philippa, I'll pass to you, I think.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So it's very important to remember that we're a social species and we need to feel connected, and sometimes all of us need support from other people, and support can range from something very informal to something that looks more like a professional intervention. The idea about how do we create a network or enhance our support network, I think the first thing all of us have to do is to ask ourselves the question, what do we find supportive? And what I find supportive may well be very different to what someone else finds supportive. So we need to ask that question. Then I think a very good step is to sit down and review your current support network, who is in it, and then make an honest assessment of how well it's working for you. That sometimes quite an uncomfortable process, but I think it's an important step. Ask yourself the question, who would you go to in a crisis? Who don't you know very well that you might like to get to know a bit better? You know, are there people on this webinar that might be part of your support network? So kind of be open about your questions, and then start listing any actions you might need to take should you feel you need to change or improve your network. And that's an ongoing process because our needs change through our lives. So you constantly review the state of your support network. So that's kind of more informal support. So for those who feel that they might need a bit more, there are so many great organisations out there providing all sorts of advice, information, counselling. Some of those are accessible 24/7. And I know that Matt has a list of organisations that I think he's going to share with you. So look at that and share it with your own network. I would just finish by saying that, you know, I'm mindful that we really are facing unprecedented challenges. We hear this a lot, but these times are quite extraordinary. So if you are struggling, and if you're feeling overwhelmed, then my counsel would be, please do reach out for support. Seeking support is never a weakness. It's actually quite the reverse. So please don't hesitate to do that.
Thanks, Philippa. And Lucile, did you have something to add to that?
On the same lines, really. I think looking for the obvious to start with, friends, family members, trusted people. Making a list is a really good piece of advice, I find, even though it might be challenging or a bit of a difficult process to start with. But also look for the non-obvious, because sometimes it might be easier to open up with someone who doesn't know you that much. So I find it easier to open up with fairly new friends than with my siblings, for example, just because of the history, because of the baggage, because of everything you've experienced and lived together. So sometimes unobvious people can also be part of your support network and would support you in a much more open way, and sometimes more non-judgmental as well. So make sure that you also look out for these persons if you do this exercise of writing that list.
Thank you, Lucile. Thank you very much. Gosh, I can't believe we're almost 3 minutes to the hour. That's gone so quickly, but such valuable information. I think it was fantastic. Thank you for that. So what I'm going to do is say thank you for joining today. Obviously, a massive thank you to Philippa, Claire, Lucile, and Heather for your time today. I think it was brilliant content, really useful, I think, for everybody. I'd also like to add that as part of our follow-up, as we've referenced, we will be including a handout which will provide a number of well-being, mental health resources to help and support you during this time. But before we finish, I thought it'd be really good to hear from you all about your biggest takeaways from the session. We don't normally do this, but I thought it'd be quite good to open this up in the chat. So for those who've attended today, if you'd just like to write down in the chat function what your biggest takeaways were from the session, because there have been so many. I know from my perspective, I'm looking at the circle of control, I think, Lucile, that you mentioned. I think that's fantastic. I think the 5 coping strategies, Philippa, fantastic again. I think the marginal gains that we talked about. I also think, Claire, when you were talking about the 4 key stages of, you know, what's the cue for your habit and so forth, how do you manage that? And I think some really great advice there. So again, like I said, that's my personal takeaway from this today, but really keen to hear what other people are saying. So again, and panelists, you can probably see this in the chat. There's a lot coming through here. A lot of people saying they found this really valuable. Again, probably reference some of the things that I've mentioned: marginal gains, stages of habits, circle of control, 5 coping strategies. So everything I've probably mentioned there, but it does look like we've had some really positive comments there. So I'm really pleased with that. So thank you all from the attendees who've actually spent the time to write down what they've taken away from this. That's really good, and really good for us, I think, to hear that, you know, this is valuable for people, you know. And I think, like I said, we're sort of in the middle of our webinar program at the moment, and I think it was quite a good opportunity to take stock and think about our mental health and our well-being, because that's going to play a part, you know, as I mentioned before, if you are, you know, currently looking for work, you know, you're in the stage of redundancy and so forth. You know, we all have a different mindset at the moment, and I think this is really good for us to focus on what we can do, some strategies to really help us. So thank you all for that. Just to finish off, next week's webinar, another key subject is the future of work. So the panelists that we have next week will talk about what's changed in the workplace since the outbreak of COVID-19. We'll look ahead to the future. We'll consider some of the predictions on office space, remote working, and probably question what are the emerging industries and job roles which are set to thrive to really help the attendees on their journey. So we hope to see you all next week. If you haven't already signed up, please do so. I will be sending the link afterwards. And also, please share the link if you know of any others who may benefit from attending these webinars. But thank you so much again to our fantastic panel, some really great advice and some great tips there. So thank you all, and look forward to speaking to you all next week. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.